They believed they were facing the American 4th Armored Division. German intelligence officers in their command posts near the Luxembourg border studied their maps in the early days of January 1945, plotting unit positions based on radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and visual sightings. The 4th Armored was a formidable force, battle-hardened from the breakout at Normandy, equipped with dozens of Sherman tanks and hundreds of combat vehicles. German commanders adjusted their defensive positions accordingly, pulling units from quieter sectors to reinforce against this armored threat. What they were actually facing was a collection of inflatable rubber tanks, a handful of sound trucks playing recordings of engine noise, and a few dozen men with radios broadcasting fake message traffic. The 4th Armored Division was miles away, fighting in an entirely different sector. The Germans had been fooled completely. This was not an accident. This was not lucky improvisation. This was the deliberate work of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit that would come to be known as the Ghost Army. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was assembled in the spring of 1944 with a mission unlike anything in American military history. While other units trained for combat, learning to advance under fire and destroy enemy positions, the 23rd trained in deception. Their weapons were not rifles and grenades, but inflatable decoys, sound equipment, and radio transmitters. Their objective was not to kill German soldiers, but to make German commanders believe things that were not true. The unit consisted of approximately 1,100 men, though the exact number fluctuated as personnel rotated through various assignments. These were not typical soldiers. Many had been recruited specifically for their artistic abilities. Fashion designer Bill Blass served in the unit. So did painter Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become one of America's most celebrated abstract artists. Art students, illustrators, architects, actors, sound engineers, and set designers filled the ranks alongside regular army personnel who handled logistics and security. The organizational structure reflected the unit's unusual mission. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers formed the corps, responsible for creating and deploying visual deceptions. The 3,132nd Sonic Company, nicknamed the Sonic Deception Unit, operated specialized sound equipment capable of projecting battlefield noises across miles. The Signal Company Special handled radio deception, creating entire phantom communication networks. The 406th Combat Engineers provided security and handled construction tasks. These 4 components worked together to create elaborate theatrical productions designed for an audience of German intelligence officers. The concept of military deception was not new in 1944. Armies had used camouflage, feints, and misinformation for centuries. What made the Ghost Army different was the industrial scale and technological sophistication of their operations. They were not simply hiding troops or spreading rumors. They were creating complete illusions of military units that did not exist, sustained over days or weeks, coordinated across multiple deception channels simultaneously. The idea emerged from British deception operations in North Africa, where dummy tanks and fake supply depots had successfully misled German and Italian forces about British strength and intentions. Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, an advertising executive turned military officer, helped develop the American version of these techniques. He understood that modern warfare involved not just destroying enemy forces, but shaping enemy perceptions and decisions. If you could make an enemy commander believe your main attack was coming from the east when it was actually coming from the west, you could achieve victory with fewer casualties. The Ghost Army's equipment was remarkable for its ingenuity and its absurdity. The inflatable tanks were pneumatic sculptures made of rubberized canvas, weighing approximately 95 pounds each when deflated and stored. A 4-man crew could inflate a dummy Sherman tank in about 5 minutes, using air compressors mounted in trucks. Once inflated, the decoys were surprisingly convincing from a distance. They had the correct dimensions, the proper silhouette, and when positioned carefully with attention to how real tanks would be deployed, they could fool aerial reconnaissance and ground observers. The deception worked because it exploited how German intelligence gathered and analyzed information. In 1944 and 1945, intelligence assessment relied on multiple sources cross-referenced to build a picture of enemy dispositions. Aerial reconnaissance provided photographs showing vehicles and equipment. Ground observers reported troop movements and unit identifications. Radio intercepts revealed communication patterns and unit designations. Signal intelligence tracked radio transmissions to locate headquarters and gauge activity levels. The Ghost Army targeted every one of these intelligence channels simultaneously. When they created a fake armored division, they did not just put up inflatable tanks. They established a complete radio network mimicking the communication patterns of a real division. Operators transmitted message traffic following proper formats and procedures, creating the electromagnetic signature of a genuine headquarters. They used the call signs and authentication codes of the unit they were impersonating, gathered through careful coordination with actual units and higher command. Visual deception went beyond the inflatable vehicles. The Ghost Army painted unit insignia on vehicles and equipment. They hung laundry on makeshift clotheslines to suggest the presence of troops bivouacked in an area. They created tire tracks showing where heavy vehicles had supposedly moved through muddy fields. They lit campfires in patterns consistent with how a real unit would deploy for the night. Small details mattered because intelligence analysts looked for these details when assessing whether a reported unit presence was genuine. The sonic deception component was perhaps the most innovative element. The 3132nd Sonic Company used specialized equipment developed at Bell Laboratories and the Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp, New York. These were not simple loudspeakers. They were directional sound projection systems, capable of broadcasting pre-recorded battlefield noises at volumes that could be heard miles away under the right atmospheric conditions. The recordings themselves were carefully crafted productions. Engineers recorded actual military operations, capturing the sounds of Sherman tanks starting their engines, idling, and moving in formation. They recorded the distinctive clank of tank tracks on pavement, the squeal of bogie wheels, the rumble of half-tracks and trucks moving in convoy. They recorded the sounds of bridging operations, with engineers shouting commands and heavy equipment being positioned. These recordings were then edited and mixed to create soundscapes representing specific military activities. In the field, sonic deception teams positioned their speakers based on terrain analysis and weather conditions. Sound travels differently depending on temperature, humidity, wind direction, and the presence of obstacles or open ground. Operators calculated where German listening posts would likely be located and adjusted their equipment accordingly. On a quiet night with favorable conditions, the sound of tanks moving into position could be heard from several miles away. German intelligence officers, receiving reports of armor movements, would find those reports consistent with what their forward observers were hearing. The psychological dimension of the deception was crucial. German commanders in early 1945 were under tremendous pressure. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were pushing from the west. Resources were limited. Intelligence about enemy strength and intentions directly informed life and death decisions about where to commit reserves, where to establish defensive lines, where to expect the next major attack. In this environment, German intelligence officers were looking for patterns and indicators that would help them predict Allied actions. The Ghost Army gave them patterns and indicators that seemed to make sense. If reconnaissance showed tanks assembling in a sector, if radio intercepts revealed an armored division, headquarters operating in that area, if ground observers reported engine sounds consistent with heavy vehicles moving at night, the logical conclusion was that an armored division was preparing for an attack in that sector. German commanders adjusted their dispositions based on this logical conclusion. What made this particularly effective was that the Ghost Army did not work in isolation. Their deceptions were coordinated with actual military operations. When real American divisions prepared for genuine attacks, the Ghost Army created phantom units, threatening different sectors. German commanders had to split their attention and resources, never certain which threat was real and which was illusion. Even if they suspected deception in some cases, they could not afford to ignore what appeared to be major troop concentrations. The men who composed this unusual unit came to their work through equally unusual paths. Military planners recognized early that effective deception required skills not typically found in combat units. They needed soldiers who could think creatively, who understood visual composition and design principles, who could solve technical problems with improvised solutions. The recruitment process targeted art schools, advertising agencies, theatre companies, and technical colleges. Bill Blass was working as a sketch artist for a New York garment manufacturer when he was drafted. His ability to quickly render accurate visual representations made him valuable for creating camouflage patterns and designing decoy installations. Ellsworth Kelly had studied at the Pratt Institute before his military service. His understanding of color, form, and spatial relationships contributed to the unit's visual deception work. These men brought civilian expertise that conventional military training could not provide. The sonic specialists came from different backgrounds. Some had worked in radio broadcasting or sound recording. Others had engineering training in acoustics and electronics. They learned to operate equipment that was experimental and temperamental. The sound projection systems required constant maintenance and adjustment. Operators learned to compensate for equipment failures during missions, improvising solutions to keep their phantom armies audible. Radio operators needed different skills. They had to master not just radio operation, but the communication procedures and patterns of the units they were impersonating. A radio operator, pretending to be part of an armored division headquarters, needed to sound like an actual armored division radio operator. This meant learning military terminology, understanding standard message formats, and developing the casual proficiency that comes from routine work. German signals intelligence personnel were trained to detect anomalies in radio traffic. If a supposedly experienced division headquarters suddenly started making procedural errors or using non-standard language, it would raise suspicions. Training for the Ghost Army took place at Camp Forest in Tennessee, and later at locations along the East Coast before deployment to Europe. The men practiced setting up inflatable equipment quickly and efficiently. They learned camouflage techniques and studied how German reconnaissance typically operated. They rehearsed radio procedures and practiced coordinating complex multi-element deceptions. The training emphasized attention to detail because small mistakes could compromise entire operations. The psychological burden on these soldiers was unique. Combat troops faced the terror of battle, but their role was straightforward: close with and destroy the enemy. Ghost Army personnel faced a different kind of pressure. Their success was measured not by ground taken or enemies killed, but by whether German commanders believed their illusions. They operated close to front lines, often within artillery range, setting up elaborate deceptions while real combat raged nearby. If the Germans discovered the deception and realized they were facing inflatable tanks rather than real armor, the consequences could be severe for actual Allied operations depending on that deception. Moreover, these men could not discuss their work. Even within the army, knowledge of the Ghost Army's existence and methods was tightly restricted. They could not write home about what they were doing. They could not seek recognition for successful operations. Their war would remain classified for decades after the fighting ended, known only to a small circle of commanders and intelligence officers who understood what the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops actually accomplished. The Ghost Army deployed to Europe in May 1944, landing in England weeks before the Normandy invasion. They did not participate in D-Day itself, but arrived in France in mid-July as Allied forces consolidated their beachhead and prepared for the breakout. Their first operation, codenamed Operation Elephant, took place near the Brittany coast in mid-August. The objective was to simulate the presence of the 2nd Armoured Division in one location, while the actual division moved to attack elsewhere. The operation followed the pattern that would become standard for Ghost Army missions. Advanced teams arrived first, conducting reconnaissance to identify suitable positions for the decoy installation. They studied the terrain, noting where German observation posts would likely be located and which approach routes enemy reconnaissance patrols might use. They identified positions where inflatable equipment would be visible from German-held territory but difficult to observe too closely. The main body arrived after dark. Trucks carrying deflated equipment moved into predetermined positions. Crews began inflating the dummy tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. Each position was chosen to create a convincing deployment pattern. Real armored units did not park their vehicles randomly. They positioned them with consideration for fields of fire, cover from aerial observation, and tactical flexibility. The Ghost Army replicated these patterns precisely. Radio operators established their phantom network, beginning transmissions that mimicked a division headquarters settling into a new position. Initial messages concerned routine administrative matters, supply requests, and coordination with adjacent units. The volume and pattern of traffic matched what German signals intelligence would expect from a recently arrived division. Operators deliberately made small mistakes, self-correcting in ways that suggested genuine military communication rather than scripted performance. Sonic teams positioned their equipment and began playing recordings of tracked vehicles moving, engines idling, and maintenance work being conducted. The sounds created an auditory landscape consistent with an armored division conducting routine operations. German listening posts, several miles away, would hear what seemed to be normal activity of a major unit settling into a tactical assembly area. The visual element extended beyond inflatable equipment. Soldiers wearing 2nd Armored Division shoulder patches visited nearby French towns, patronizing cafes and shops where they would be seen by local civilians. The Germans maintained intelligence networks among the French population, and information about American unit movements filtered back through these channels. Seeing soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division drinking coffee in a particular town reinforced the illusion that the division was operating in that sector. Operation Elephant lasted approximately 4 days. During that time, the actual 2nd Armored Division moved to its real objective area and launched its attack. German forces in the sector where the Ghost Army operated maintained defensive positions, apparently convinced they faced a significant armored threat. When the real attack came from a different direction, German commanders had to rapidly redeploy forces, disrupting their defensive plans. The operation succeeded in its primary objective, deceiving German intelligence about American intentions. Post-war examination of German military records confirmed that their intelligence assessments during this period placed the 2nd Armored Division precisely where the Ghost Army had created its illusion. German commanders made decisions based on this false information, committing resources to defend against a threat that did not exist in that location. Subsequent operations refined the Ghost Army's techniques. Operation Brittany in September 1944 simulated 2 divisions simultaneously, creating the impression of a major force threatening the port city of Brest. The operation required coordinating multiple deception elements across a wide geographic area. Radio networks for both phantom divisions operated simultaneously, with message traffic flowing between simulated headquarters and subordinate units. Inflatable equipment was deployed at multiple locations, creating the visual signature of large formations assembling for an assault. The sonic component became more sophisticated. Engineers learned that certain sounds were more effective than others at creating convincing illusions. The sound of tanks moving in convoy was distinctive and carried well across open terrain. The sounds of bridging operations suggested preparations for river crossings, influencing German assessments of likely attack routes. Operators varied their recordings to avoid repetitive patterns that might alert careful listeners. Weather and terrain significantly affected operations. Rain made it difficult to maintain inflatable equipment as water accumulated in folds and wrinkles. Wind could damage or displace decoys that were not properly anchored. Cold temperatures made the rubber material less flexible and harder to inflate properly. Operators adapted to these conditions, developing techniques for rapid deployment and weatherproofing that were not covered in their training. The danger was constant. The Ghost Army operated near front lines, often within range of German artillery. Enemy patrols sometimes probed close to decoy positions. If Germans discovered that what appeared to be a tank park was actually inflatable equipment, the deception would be compromised and future operations endangered. Security personnel maintained careful watch, prepared to defend the installations if necessary. Several close calls tested the unit's operational security. During one operation in France, a German patrol approached close enough to observe the decoy installation. Ghost Army security personnel engaged them, preventing close examination of the equipment. The brief firefight killed one German soldier and forced the patrol to withdraw. The incident was reported up German chain of command as contact with American security elements protecting an armored unit assembly area, precisely the interpretation the Ghost Army wanted. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological reality of Ghost Army operations became clear during Operation Viersen in March 1945. The mission involved simulating the Ninth Army, preparing to cross the Rhine River at Viersen, while the actual crossing would occur miles to the south, near Remagen. This was the Ghost Army's largest and most complex operation, requiring coordination of all deception elements to create a convincing threat that would fix German forces in place. The stakes were extraordinarily high. The Rhine crossing represented a critical phase of the campaign to defeat Germany. If Allied forces could establish bridgeheads across the Rhine and break into Germany's industrial heartland, the war's end would accelerate significantly. German commanders understood this perfectly and were prepared to commit substantial forces to defend the river. The Ghost Army's mission was to make them commit those forces in the wrong location. Preparation began weeks before the operation commenced. Intelligence officers analyzed German defensive positions along the Rhine, identifying sectors where defenders would be most sensitive to threats. They studied German intelligence collection methods, determining what indicators would most effectively convince enemy analysts that a major crossing was imminent. The deception plan called for creating the impression of extensive preparation, bridge construction equipment being moved forward, assault boats being assembled, artillery concentrating for preparatory bombardment. The operation required unprecedented scale. More than 600 inflatable vehicles were deployed, creating the visual signature of multiple divisions assembling for assault. Radio networks simulated not just division headquarters, but also supporting elements, combat engineers, artillery battalions, and logistical units. The phantom order of battle was complex and detailed, consistent with how Allied forces actually organized river-crossing operations. Sonic teams played recordings of heavy construction equipment, suggesting bridge components being moved into position and assembly areas being prepared. They broadcast sounds of large unit movements, creating the auditory impression of divisions shifting into assault positions. The recordings ran for hours each night, creating a sustained pattern of activity that German listening posts would certainly detect and report. Visual deception extended to elaborate staging. Ghost Army personnel created dummy supply dumps visible from German observation posts across the river. They positioned inflatable artillery pieces in firing positions, barrels elevated as if prepared for bombardment. They created vehicle tracks, showing where heavy equipment had supposedly moved through staging areas. They even set up mock command posts with radio antennas and communications equipment, creating the electromagnetic signature of headquarters elements. The operation lasted 10 days, from March 13th through March 23rd, 1945. During this time, the actual Rhine crossing operation developed far to the south. American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th and rapidly expanded their bridgehead. By the time Operation Viersen concluded, thousands of American troops were across the Rhine, advancing into Germany proper. German military records examined after the war confirmed the deception's effectiveness. Intelligence reports from the period identified the Ghost Army's phantom units as real formations preparing for assault at Viersen. German commanders allocated defensive forces accordingly, creating concentration of strength opposite the simulated threat. When the real attacks came from different sectors, German defenders were poorly positioned to respond effectively. The human cost of Ghost Army operations remained remarkably low considering their proximity to combat. The unit suffered few casualties relative to its size and duration of service. This was partly due to the nature of their work, setting up deceptions and then withdrawing before enemy forces could engage in strength, but also reflected careful operational planning that minimized exposure to direct combat. However, the psychological burden was substantial. These soldiers lived with constant awareness that their effectiveness depended on Germans believing their illusions. Every operation carried the fear that discovery would compromise not just their mission, but also endanger the real operations, depending on successful deception. They worked in conditions of extreme stress, setting up elaborate installations while real battles occurred nearby, never certain whether German intelligence was accepting their deception or preparing to exploit it. The technical challenges of Ghost Army operations were immense and required constant innovation. The inflatable equipment, while ingenious, was never designed for the conditions of frontline service. The rubber material degraded in cold weather, becoming brittle and prone to tearing. Repairs required vulcanizing equipment and specialized materials not always available in field conditions. Maintenance crews learned to patch tiers using improvised techniques, sometimes cannibalizing damaged decoys to keep others operational. Transportation logistics were complex. Each inflatable tank, while relatively light, required careful packing to prevent damage during transport. A single truck could carry several deflated tanks, but loading and unloading required time and care. Compressors for inflation were heavy and fuel-intensive. Each operation required moving tons of equipment over roads, often damaged by combat, through areas sometimes under artillery fire, to positions that might need to be evacuated rapidly if German forces counterattacked. Radio deception demanded extraordinary attention to detail. The Ghost Army's signal personnel studied actual unit communication patterns extensively. They learned the distinctive styles of different operators, the standard phrases used in military radio traffic, the proper protocols for authentication and message routing. They practiced until their transmissions were indistinguishable from genuine military communications. German signals intelligence was sophisticated and thorough. Enemy monitoring stations tracked radio frequencies, logged transmission times, analyzed message volumes, and attempted to identify individual operators by their distinctive sending styles, known as FIST in radio terminology. A careless operator using non-standard procedures or making unusual errors could alert German analysts that something was wrong. The Ghost Army's radio operators had to be perfect in their impersonation, maintaining consistent performance over hours of transmission. The sonic deception technology was experimental and temperamental. The sound projection systems used by the 3132nd Sonic Company were based on directional speaker arrays designed at Bell Laboratories. These were not simple public address systems. They used specially designed horns and driver units capable of projecting sound over long distances with minimal dispersion. The systems could broadcast at sound pressure levels exceeding 120 decibels, equivalent to a jet engine at close range. Operating this equipment required both technical knowledge and artistic judgment. Engineers had to position speakers based on terrain analysis, calculating how sound would propagate given current atmospheric conditions. They adjusted volume and frequency response to maximize carrying distance while maintaining recognizable sound quality. The recordings themselves required careful selection and sequencing. Playing the same sound loop repeatedly would create patterns that careful listeners might recognize as artificial. Operators varied their playback, creating dynamic soundscapes that mimicked the natural variation of real military activities. Atmospheric conditions profoundly affected sonic operations. Temperature inversions, where warm air trapped cooler air near the ground, could create sound channels that carried noise much farther than normal. Wind direction either enhanced or degraded sound propagation, depending on whether it carried sound toward or away from German positions. Humidity affected how sound absorbed or reflected in the atmosphere. Sonic teams monitored weather conditions constantly, adjusting their operations to exploit favorable conditions and compensate for unfavorable ones. The coordination required for successful operations was extraordinary. Visual, sonic, and radio deception elements had to work in perfect synchronization. If radio traffic indicated a division was moving into position, inflatable equipment had to be visible in that location, and sonic effects had to provide corresponding auditory evidence. Any discrepancy between deception channels could alert German intelligence that something was wrong. Operations officers created detailed timelines, specifying exactly when each element would activate and what it would simulate. Security concerns were paramount. The Ghost Army's effectiveness depended on Germans not discovering that they were being deceived. This meant not only hiding the inflatable nature of equipment, but also preventing Germans from capturing Ghost Army personnel who might reveal the deception under interrogation. Security protocols required that if positions were in danger of being overrun, all equipment would be destroyed and personnel evacuated before Germans could examine the installation or capture knowledgeable prisoners. The Ghost Army's final operation occurred in late March, 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany. Operation Viersen had demonstrated the unit's capabilities at maximum scale, but subsequent operations continued through the final weeks of European combat. By April, German military cohesion was collapsing. Intelligence systems that had functioned throughout the war were breaking down as communications infrastructure failed and command structures disintegrated. The environment that made Ghost Army deceptions effective was disappearing. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had conducted more than 20 documented deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They had simulated the presence of entire divisions, created phantom build-ups for major offensives, and diverted German attention from actual Allied operations. Conservative estimates suggested their work had saved thousands of American lives by forcing Germans to disperse forces against threats that did not exist. The unit's effectiveness could be measured through captured German intelligence documents examined after the war. These documents repeatedly identified Ghost Army phantom units as real formations. German situation maps plotted divisions that existed only as inflatable equipment and radio signals. Battle plans allocated defensive resources against threats that were theatrical productions. Intelligence assessments written by experienced German officers accepted the deceptions completely, incorporating false information into their understanding of Allied strength and intentions. One particularly striking example came from German 15th Army intelligence reports during the period when the Ghost Army simulated Allied preparations for Rhine crossings. The reports identified specific American divisions by designation, plotted their supposed positions, and assessed their probable objectives. Every identification was wrong, every position was false. Every assessment was based on deception. German commanders reading these reports made decisions committing troops and resources to counter operations that would never occur. The human dimension of this success was complex. Ghost Army personnel knew their work was effective, but they could not know the full extent of their achievement. They saw immediate tactical results, German forces reacting to their deceptions, but the strategic implications remained classified. These soldiers returned home after the war, unable to discuss what they had done. The unit's existence remained classified, its records sealed, its operations unknown except to a small circle of military and intelligence officials. For decades, Ghost Army veterans lived with the strange burden of having participated in significant military operations they could not acknowledge. They had served their country in an unusual and important way, but they received no public recognition. They could not share their experiences with family members or include their service details in personal histories. The war they fought remained secret long after the shooting war ended. Bill Blass returned to the fashion industry, eventually founding his own company and becoming one of America's most successful designers. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, he could not explain the actual nature of his work. Ellsworth Kelly resumed his art career, developing the minimalist style that would make him famous. His military experience remained largely unknown even to those familiar with his artistic achievements. Other Ghost Army veterans returned to civilian life carrying similar secrets, their wartime contributions unacknowledged and largely forgotten. The classification lasted until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. When documents were finally declassified, historians could examine the full scope of Ghost Army operations. The story that emerged was remarkable, revealing an aspect of World War II that had been completely hidden from public knowledge. Veterans, many now elderly, could finally discuss their service openly. Interviews and memoirs provided first-hand accounts of operations that had existed only in classified files. The declassification revealed something profound about modern warfare. The Ghost Army's success demonstrated that in industrial-scale conflict between modern nations, perception could be as important as reality. A fake division that convinced enemy commanders to misallocate resources was, in strategic terms, almost as valuable as a real division. The 1,100 men of the Ghost Army, armed with inflatable equipment and sound recordings, achieved effects that would have required tens of thousands of combat troops using conventional methods. This raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of military effectiveness. Traditional military thinking emphasized firepower, mobility, and the capacity to close with and destroy enemy forces. The Ghost Army operated on different principles entirely. They never fired shots in anger except for security purposes. They never took ground or destroyed enemy formations. Yet their contribution to Allied victory was substantial, perhaps greater than many conventional units that fought pitched battles and suffered heavy casualties. The broader implications extended beyond World War II into the nature of information warfare and military deception in modern conflict. The Ghost Army represented an early recognition that in wars between technologically advanced adversaries, the informational dimension of conflict could be decisive. German commanders made decisions based on their understanding of Allied capabilities and intentions. By manipulating that understanding, the Ghost Army shaped German decisions in ways favorable to Allied objectives. This principle would become increasingly important in subsequent conflicts. The Cold War saw extensive efforts by both American and Soviet forces to deceive the other side about military capabilities, force dispositions, and strategic intentions. Electronic warfare, signals intelligence, and counterintelligence operations aim to control what adversaries knew and believed about military realities. The techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army, adapted for new technologies, became standard elements of military doctrine. The Ghost Army also demonstrated the value of unconventional thinking in military organizations. Traditional military culture emphasized conformity, discipline, and adherence to established procedures. The Ghost Army succeeded precisely because it brought civilian creativity and artistic sensibility to military problems. Fashion designers, painters, and sound engineers approached deception challenges with perspectives that conventionally trained officers might not have considered. Their success suggested that military effectiveness sometimes required breaking free from standard patterns of thought. The industrial dimension remained significant. The Ghost Army's equipment, from inflatable tanks to sonic projection systems, represented American manufacturing capability applied to unconventional military requirements. The rubber companies that produced inflatable equipment, the electronics firms that built sound systems, and the logistics networks that delivered and maintained this specialized gear all demonstrated the breadth of American industrial mobilization. Even in deception operations, material superiority mattered. The psychological cost of Ghost Army service, while different from combat trauma, was real and lasting. Veterans described the strange tension of conducting operations where success meant nothing happened, where the absence of German reaction indicated that deception was working. They recalled the constant fear that discovery would compromise not just their mission, but endanger other units depending on their deception. They remembered the isolation of serving in a unit whose very existence was secret, unable to seek recognition or acknowledgement for successful operations. Some veterans struggled with the moral dimensions of their work. They had participated in elaborate deceptions, lying systematically and comprehensively to achieve military objectives. While the lies served legitimate purposes in wartime, the psychological weight of sustained deception affected some individuals. They had spent months or years constructing false realities, knowing that German soldiers might die because their commanders believed Ghost Army illusions. The ethical complexity of this work persisted long after the war ended. The unit's legacy influenced subsequent military deception efforts. American forces in later conflicts used similar techniques, adapted for different circumstances and technologies. In the Gulf War of 1991, coalition forces conducted extensive deception operations to mislead Iraqi commanders about the timing and direction of ground attacks. These operations drew explicitly on Ghost Army precedents, using dummy equipment, false radio traffic, and coordinated multi-channel deceptions to shape enemy perceptions. The transition from secrecy to public knowledge changed how the Ghost Army was remembered and understood. When operations were classified, only military professionals could study and learn from Ghost Army techniques. Declassification allowed broader analysis, bringing perspectives from historians, artists, and cultural critics. The story became part of popular culture, featured in documentaries, books, and exhibitions. This popularization sometimes oversimplified the Ghost Army's work, emphasizing entertaining aspects while minimizing the technical sophistication and constant danger of actual operations. Veterans interviewed after declassification emphasized several themes consistently. They took pride in their work, recognizing that their unusual skills had contributed meaningfully to Allied victory. They felt vindicated that their service, so long unacknowledged, could finally be recognized publicly. They expressed regret that many Ghost Army members died before declassification, never receiving public acknowledgement of their contributions, and they emphasized the seriousness of their mission, pushing back against characterizations that treated Ghost Army operations as clever pranks rather than dangerous military operations with strategic consequences. The Ghost Army's story reveals something fundamental about World War II and about warfare more broadly. The conflict was not simply a contest of firepower and industrial production, though those elements were crucial. It was also a contest of perception and information, where understanding what the enemy believed could be as important as understanding what the enemy possessed. The Germans who studied their intelligence reports in early 1945, plotting American unit positions and assessing Allied capabilities, were making life and death decisions, based on information that was systematically and deliberately false. Those German officers were not stupid or incompetent. They were professionals doing their jobs with the tools and methods available to them. They collected information from multiple sources, cross-referenced reports, applied analytical frameworks developed through years of military experience. By all conventional standards, they were conducting intelligence assessment correctly. What they did not account for was that the entire information environment had been manipulated. The radio signals they intercepted were deliberate transmissions designed to deceive. The vehicles their reconnaissance observed were inflatable sculptures. The sounds their listening posts detected were recordings played through directional speakers. This created a kind of systematic blindness, where the more carefully German intelligence officers studied the evidence, the more convinced they became of conclusions that were completely wrong. The thoroughness of their analysis became a liability, because Ghost Army deceptions were designed to withstand careful scrutiny. Every element of the illusion supported every other element. Visual, sonic, and signals evidence all pointed to the same false conclusion. The deception was not a simple trick, but a comprehensive, alternate reality constructed specifically to exploit German intelligence methods. The irony was profound. German military intelligence in World War II was generally competent and sometimes excellent. German signals intelligence achieved significant successes throughout the war. German photo interpreters were skilled at extracting information from reconnaissance imagery. German interrogators were effective at gathering information from prisoners. These capabilities made Germany a formidable adversary. Yet these same capabilities made German intelligence vulnerable to deception operations that targeted their analytical methods and assumptions. The Ghost Army exploited this vulnerability systematically. They understood how German intelligence worked and constructed deceptions that would appear credible when analyzed using German methods. They created false evidence that survived scrutiny because it was consistent with how genuine evidence would appear. They maintained their deceptions long enough that German intelligence could build confidence in their assessments, incorporating false information into broader understanding of Allied forces and intentions. The result was that German commanders, believing they understood American strength and plans, made strategic decisions that served Allied objectives. They concentrated forces against phantom threats, leaving real attack routes weakly defended. They withheld reserves to counter build-ups that did not exist, making those reserves unavailable when real offensives developed. They assessed Allied capabilities incorrectly, leading to operational planning based on false premises. The 1,100 men of Tets, the Ghost Army, with their inflatable tanks and sound recordings, shaped the battlefield more effectively than many conventional combat units. This remains the enduring lesson of the Ghost Army story. Modern warfare involves not just destroying enemy forces, but shaping enemy perceptions and decisions. The side that controls what the enemy believes has enormous advantages, potentially decisive ones. Technology changes how deception is conducted, from inflatable equipment in World War II to sophisticated electronic warfare in contemporary conflicts. But the fundamental principle remains constant. In wars between advanced adversaries with capable intelligence systems, the ability to systematically mislead enemy assessment can be as valuable as firepower and mobility. The men who served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops understood this intuitively, even when they could not discuss it publicly. They had participated in operations that demonstrated new dimensions of warfare. They had proven that creativity, technical innovation, and psychological insight could achieve strategic effects without firing shots. They had shown that in modern conflict, perception and reality were not always the same thing, and that skilled operators could exploit the gap between them. When those German intelligence officers studied their maps in January 1945, confident they were tracking American 4th Armored Division movements, they were experiencing the Ghost Army's ultimate achievement. They believed completely, they acted on their beliefs, and they were wrong in ways that advantaged every actual Allied operation in the sector. The inflatable tanks and sound recordings had done precisely what they were designed to do: create a believable alternate reality that shaped enemy decisions. That remains the measure of the Ghost Army's success and their contribution to Allied victory in World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.